A millionaire pretends to be poor to find true love. What happens next stuns everyone. Michael Harrison had it all. As one of the wealthiest young entrepreneurs in the city, he could have anything he wanted at a moment's notice. His expansive estate sat at the edge of the city, offering panoramic views of the glittering skyline. The marble floors and sparkling chandeliers seemed to reflect the life he had built, one of extravagance and success. He had a fleet of luxury cars, each more powerful and more expensive than the last. His wardrobe was filled with designer suits, and his weekends were spent at exclusive resorts, indulging in the finest food and wine. To the outside world, Michael was the epitome of success. He was a millionaire, respected in his field, admired by his peers, and envied by many. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. However, despite the outward appearance of happiness, Michael felt a deep, gnawing emptiness inside. He had no one to share his life with. His relationships were fleeting, shallow, and often built on superficial attractions. Women were drawn to him because of his wealth, but he knew that very few were genuinely interested in who he was beneath the surface. They flattered him, showering him with affection when it was convenient, but when the money was no longer the focus, their affection faded. Michael could never truly connect with anyone. Each new romantic relationship started with excitement, but eventually, he felt more like an object than a person. The idea of someone loving him for the man he was, rather than for the lifestyle he could offer, seemed like an impossible dream. It wasn't just romantic relationships that left Michael feeling hollow. His friendships were equally disappointing. They were often transactional, people in his circle wanting something from him, whether it was money, connections, or status. His closest friends were colleagues who also reveled in their wealth, and the conversations between them were always about the latest business deals, the next big acquisition, or the best places to dine. There was no real depth to the conversations. There were no discussions about dreams, about passions, or about the things that truly mattered. Michael found himself surrounded by people, but he felt more alone than ever. He was a millionaire with thousands of acquaintances, but no real friends. Every night, as he lay in his luxurious king-size bed, Michael would stare up at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of what he was missing. He would look at the perfectly manicured lawn outside his window and wonder if it was possible to find real love in a world so focused on material things. Was there anyone out there who could love him without expecting anything in return? Was there anyone who could see beyond his wealth and love him for the person he was? Michael had begun to fear that such a person didn't exist. It wasn't always like this. There had been a time, early in his life, when Michael had been hopeful about the future. Raised in a modest household, he had worked his way up from nothing. His father had been a school teacher, and his mother worked as a nurse. They instilled in him the values of hard work, integrity, and the importance of helping others. Michael had always dreamed of achieving success, of providing a better life for his family, but the wealth he had gained over the years had come at a cost. It had distanced him from the very people he had hoped to help. He often thought about his parents, both of whom had passed away a few years earlier. They would have been so proud of his success, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow lost his way. His desire for wealth had driven him to focus so much on business deals and financial growth that he had neglected the personal aspects of life. He had become consumed by the pursuit of more money, more success, more accolades, until the pursuit itself had drained the joy from everything he once loved. At business dinners and networking events, Michael would sometimes catch glimpses of couples sitting across from one another, holding hands, or laughing at a shared joke. There was a warmth between them that Michael longed for, a connection that seemed to come effortlessly to those who had nothing but each other. Michael had tried dating in the past, but the relationships always felt superficial. He had been on numerous blind dates arranged by well-meaning friends or introduced to women at high-profile charity events. In the beginning, there was always excitement. There was the allure of being with someone beautiful, someone intelligent, someone impressive in their own right. But as the days went on, the conversations grew shallow, the excitement wore off, and he was left with the same sense of dissatisfaction. The women were polite, but they always seemed to gravitate toward his wealth, his lifestyle, rather than his personality. And then there were the stories. The stories his friends told him about how women would approach them, pretending to be interested in their lives and personalities, only to reveal their true motives after a few dates. Gold diggers, all of them. Michael had seen it firsthand. The conversations would inevitably turn to his financial success, with questions about his investments, his property, and his extravagant vacations. It made him sick to his stomach. He wasn't naive enough to believe that everyone who showed interest in him was after his fortune, but it was difficult to separate the genuine from the opportunistic. One fateful evening, after yet another disappointing date with a woman who had seemed so promising, Michael found himself sitting at his favorite restaurant, a luxurious venue with chandeliers and velvet-lined chairs. He was watching a couple at the table next to him, a man and a woman who appeared to be in their early 30s. They were laughing and chatting, clearly in love, clearly happy. The woman leaned in to kiss the man, and as Michael observed them, a pang of longing shot through him. He wondered if he would ever know that kind of love, the kind of love that wasn't tainted by ulterior motives. As he sipped his wine, Michael overheard a conversation between two women at the table across from him. One of them was speaking about her recent date with a rich businessman, and as she described it, Michael's heart sank. She mentioned how he had been nice enough, but the conversation quickly turned to his wealth. The women discussed his expensive car, his lavish home, and the lavish gifts he'd given her. Michael felt a lump form in his throat. It was then that he realized the awful truth. He had become just like the rich businessman the women were gossiping about. He had become nothing more than a status symbol, a man to be admired for his possessions, not his character. That night, as Michael lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling once again, the realization hit him harder than it ever had before. He had everything, money, success, the perfect life on paper, but he had nothing real. He had no one who loved him for who he truly was. He felt like a ghost, surrounded by people but never truly seen. In that moment, Michael made a decision. He couldn't go on like this. He couldn't continue living in a world where everything was about money and status. He longed for something more. He wanted to find love, real love. And he knew that in order to do that, he would have to leave behind everything that had defined him for so long. It was a difficult decision, and it didn't come easily. Michael thought about how he had built his empire, how hard he had worked to get to this point, and how much he had sacrificed to achieve success. But it no longer seemed worth it. What was the point of all the wealth and success if he couldn't find someone who truly cared about him? He needed to escape the life that had suffocated him and try something completely different. As he lay there in the silence of his bedroom, Michael made a promise to himself. He would find a way to experience life without the constraints of wealth. He would take a step back from his fortune, even if only for a short time, and find out what it meant to truly live, without the luxury, the status, or the expectations. He was ready for a change. He was ready to find true love, even if it meant starting over from scratch. This was the beginning of Michael's journey, a journey that would take him far from the life he had known and lead him to the kind of love he had always dreamed of, but never thought possible. It was a journey that would force him to question everything he had built and ultimately show him that the greatest treasure in life was not found in the things he owned, but in the people he loved. Michael Harrison had everything a man could ask for: wealth, power, and recognition. He had built his empire from the ground up, and at just 35 years old, he was the embodiment of success. Yet, for all the material possessions that surrounded him, something was missing in his life, something he could not ignore any longer. His desire for genuine love had become a quiet ache that haunted him in the corners of his mind, growing louder with each passing day. For years, Michael had been chasing after the wrong things. When he had started his business venture, he had been driven by ambition, by the dream of making something of himself and proving that a man could rise from humble beginnings to achieve greatness. The money had come quickly, followed by status, respect, and admiration. He had surrounded himself with luxury, acquiring all the possessions that society told him would make him happy. But the truth was, none of it had filled the void inside him. He had tried to ignore it, to bury his feelings beneath the surface. After all, Wasn't success supposed to bring happiness? Wasn't that the message the world constantly repeated? Michael should have been content. He should have been grateful for everything he had accomplished, and yet, he couldn't shake the emptiness that seemed to grow inside him with every passing day. It wasn't that he regretted his success. Rather, he regretted what he had lost in the process. He had lost the ability to connect with people on a deeper level. He had lost the chance to experience true love, the kind that transcended wealth, status, and superficial attraction. He had been on countless dates, met hundreds of women, and yet every time he thought he was on the verge of something real, the same pattern emerged. The women he met were charming, intelligent, and beautiful, but as soon as they discovered who he was and how much money he had, their behavior changed. It was subtle at first, a smile that lingered a little longer, a question about his career that seemed a bit too probing, but Michael could always tell. He could see it in their eyes. They weren't interested in him. They were interested in what he could provide. It wasn't love, it was admiration for his wealth. Over the years, this realization had crushed Michael's spirit. He had become a pawn in the game of wealth and status, and it seemed that every woman he met saw him as nothing more than a walking paycheck. This wasn't what he had imagined love would be. He had dreamt of finding someone who saw him for who he was, someone who valued his character, his integrity, and his ability to love. But as the years passed, that dream seemed increasingly out of reach. It was during one of these sleepless nights, as Michael lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, that his frustration finally reached its peak. He had been thinking about his latest failed relationship, the one that had ended just a few weeks ago. At first, he had been so hopeful. Natalie was kind, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in him. She listened to his stories about his childhood, his business, his dreams for the future. They had spent hours talking about their shared values and goals. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, this was the one. But it hadn't taken long for her to ask the question he dreaded most. How much money do you make? The question wasn't asked in a malicious way, but it might as well have been. Michael had learned the hard way that once the topic of money was broached, everything else became secondary. That was the turning point in his relationship with Natalie. She had become more distant, less interested in his thoughts and ideas, more focused on his assets, his cars, his home. She began suggesting extravagant dates and talking about how much easier life could be with more money. Michael had tried to brush it off, but the damage had already been done. She had stopped seeing him as Michael, the man, and started seeing him as Michael, the millionaire. As he lay in bed that night, Michael realized the painful truth. He was no closer to finding true love than he had been when he started his journey. In fact, he was further away from it. The women he met were either too enamored with his wealth to see who he really was, or they were so focused on their own ambitions that they didn't care. The love he so desperately wanted seemed like a distant dream, and the more he sought it, the more elusive it became. But it wasn't just the failed relationships that were weighing on Michael's mind. It was the loneliness. He had spent so many years working tirelessly to build his fortune, to create a life that others would envy, that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered: human connection. The friendships he had were shallow, transactional. They revolved around business deals, investments, and social status. He had no one to turn to for emotional support, no one to share his thoughts with, no one to confide in. The irony of it all was that Michael had always been a giving person. He had built his wealth not just for himself, but with the intention of helping others. He had donated millions to charities, funded scholarships for underprivileged students, and created foundations that supported causes close to his heart. He believed in the power of giving, but he had never experienced the joy of receiving in return, at least not in the way that truly mattered. Michael's family had always taught him the importance of love and human connection. His parents had raised him with the values of kindness, generosity, and compassion. But as he grew older and his career took off, those values had been overshadowed by the pursuit of success. He had stopped prioritizing relationships in favor of building his empire, and now, years later, he found himself regretting it. The turning point came one afternoon, after yet another frustrating meeting with his business associates. Michael had always prided himself on his work ethic and his ability to make decisions quickly and decisively. But that day, something was different. As his colleagues discussed a new business venture, Michael found himself zoning out, his mind wandering to thoughts of the emptiness he felt. He couldn't focus on the conversation. He couldn't bring himself to care about the next big deal. What did it all mean if he couldn't find someone to share his life with? At that moment, Michael knew he had to make a change. He couldn't keep living in this cycle of superficial relationships and empty success. He had everything he could ever want, but he didn't have what he truly needed: real, authentic love. It was then that he realized that love, true love, was not something that could be bought or manufactured. It was something that had to be earned through vulnerability, trust, and understanding. It was something that could not be found in a mansion or in the pages of a bank statement. For the first time in a long time, Michael allowed himself to feel the depth of his desire for love. He realized that it wasn't just about finding a partner who loved him for who he was beneath the wealth. It was about finding someone who could truly see him, who could look past the success and see the man he had always been underneath. It was about finding someone who valued him for his heart, not his wallet. This realization became the driving force behind his decision to change his life completely. In the weeks that followed, Michael began to formulate a plan. He knew that in order to find true love, he would have to step out of his comfort zone and away from the world that had defined him for so long. He would have to leave behind the persona of the wealthy businessman and start over as someone completely different. It was a terrifying thought, but it was the only way he could see to achieve the one thing he wanted most: a genuine connection with another person. Michael's desire for love had become his most powerful motivator. It was no longer about finding someone to fit into his perfect world. It was about stepping into the unknown, embracing vulnerability, and opening his heart to someone who could love him for who he truly was. This desire for love, authentic and real, would push him forward on a journey that would change his life forever. As he began to prepare for the drastic change he was about to make, Michael realized that he was not only seeking love, but seeking himself. He was ready to let go of the trappings of his success and discover what it meant to live authentically, without the mask of wealth and status. This desire to love and be loved, without conditions or expectations, was the spark that would set his journey in motion. It was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one where love, not money, would be his guiding light. Michael Harrison, once the epitome of wealth, had always defined his life by his financial success. He lived in a luxurious penthouse that overlooked the glittering skyline of the city, attended exclusive galas, and enjoyed the company of individuals who admired him mostly for his status and the wealth he represented. To him, this was the life he had earned, the reward for years of hard work and shrewd decisions in the business world. However, despite the outward success and the material wealth, Michael felt a deep sense of emptiness within himself. The people who surrounded him, though pleasant, had never truly known him. Instead, they were often drawn to him because of his wealth, his ability to provide access to exclusive circles, and his impressive portfolio of investments. Michael had always been someone who sought out control, whether in business or in his personal life. He had built a life where everything was meticulously planned. From his business meetings that ran on precise schedules to his carefully curated social calendar, every part of his world was constructed to reflect his success. His wealth had provided him with the ability to avoid discomfort and inconvenience, creating a comfortable bubble that kept him distanced from the realities of everyday life. But there was a gnawing feeling inside of him, a growing sense that his success had come at a price he was no longer willing to pay. The turning point came during a night out at an exclusive club. As he sat across from an elegant woman, his conversation drifting between business and light flirtation, he realized how predictable it all was. She was beautiful, of course, but it was clear that she was far more interested in his bank account than in him as a person. The realization was a sharp pang that broke through the numbness he had been living in for years. Michael had grown tired of this superficiality, tired of being surrounded by people who were more interested in what he had than in who he truly was. The moment felt like a revelation. He didn't need more wealth, more luxury, or more admiration from the wrong kind of people. What he longed for was something real, something genuine. What he craved was love, not for his money, but for himself. It was this moment that spurred him into action. Michael M. Aude the decision to change everything. He would leave behind the life of luxury that had defined him for so long. He would become a different person, one who had to earn his way and live humbly. He would live as a man of modest means, working a regular job, interacting with people who didn't know him for his wealth, but for his character. And so, he devised a plan to live a life of anonymity. He would work at a café, a local establishment far removed from the world of private jets and boardroom meetings. In doing so, he hoped to find someone who valued him for who he truly was. Michael's first challenge was to create a new identity. He spent days thinking about who he would become, what kind of man he would pretend to be. It wasn't just about his appearance, it was about adopting a whole new way of living. He had always been impeccably dressed in tailored suits and had a reputation for being well-groomed, but that wouldn't work in his new life. People wouldn't see him as the man he wanted them to if he wore expensive clothes or displayed signs of wealth. He needed to blend in. So, he began to transform his wardrobe. The tailored suits were replaced with simple jeans and t-shirts, comfortable shoes, and modest jackets. His wardrobe was now unremarkable, as though he had never known a life of luxury. He even took to wearing a cap, a simple accessory that could help mask his identity. Michael had to shed the image of the man who had it all in order to become someone who was simply trying to find himself. The next challenge was finding the right job. Michael wanted a position where he could stay under the radar, where no one would recognize him. After some consideration, he decided that working at a cafe would be the best fit. He could start fresh, learn the ropes of a humble job, and meet people who didn't care about his past. He chose a small, cozy cafe in a quiet part of the city, a place where regulars came to relax and catch up over coffee. The cafe was nothing like the upscale restaurants he was accustomed to. There were no crystal chandeliers or gourmet meals. Instead, it was simple, with mismatched chairs and wooden tables. The smell of fresh brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air, and the sound of quiet conversations and the clink of coffee cups created an ambience of comfort and familiarity. This was the kind of place Michael had always overlooked, but now it felt like a refuge, a place where he could truly be himself. Walking into the cafe for the first time in his new persona was a surreal experience for Michael. It was early morning, and the cafe was already bustling with activity. The owner, Frank, was behind the counter, greeting customers with a friendly smile, while the other baristas hurried to prepare drinks. Michael felt out of place, but he was determined to make it work. He introduced himself as Jake, a new employee looking for a fresh start. Frank looked him over, skeptical but open to giving him a chance. Frank had been in the business for years and had seen all kinds of people come and go, but something about Jake, made him think that this young man might be different. Michael's first day behind the counter was a whirlwind. He had never worked in food service before, and the pace was faster than he had anticipated. He struggled to learn the ins and outs of the espresso machine, fumbling with the milk steamer and forgetting the correct order of drinks. At first, it was humiliating. Here he was, a man who had once made multi-million-dollar deals with ease, now struggling to make a cappuccino. The customers who came in for their morning fix didn't care about his background or his wealth. They just wanted their coffee, and they weren't shy about showing their impatience when Michael made a mistake. He was humbled in a way he had never been before. It was a difficult pill to swallow, but it was exactly what he needed. Throughout the day, he found himself making small talk with the regular customers who passed through the cafe. There was Jamie, a young woman who worked as a part-time artist, and David, a retired history teacher who spent his mornings reading the newspaper in the corner booth. They were kind to him, offering encouragement when he made a mistake and chatting with him as if he were just another person in their small community. It was a stark contrast to the superficial conversations he had grown accustomed to in his old life. Here, people spoke from the heart. They didn't ask about his net worth or his connections. They simply asked about his day, his interests, and his life. Michael had never realized how isolating his old life had been. Despite all the wealth and success, he had never truly connected with anyone on a meaningful level. As the weeks passed, Michael began to settle into his new life. He became more confident behind the counter, learning the intricacies of the cafe business. He learned to memorize the regular orders, to greet customers by name, and to interact with them in a way that felt natural. He found himself enjoying the small moments, serving a cup of coffee with a smile, sharing a laugh with Jamie, or having a deep conversation with David about history. For the first time in years, Michael felt like he was part of something real, something that didn't revolve around money or status. But it wasn't just the cafe that was changing him. It was the people he met. He started to notice the little things about the regulars that made their lives unique. There was Frank, the cafe owner, who had built this place from the ground up with little more than hard work and determination. There was Jamie, who dreamed of becoming a painter but was willing to work in the cafe to support herself. And then there was Sarah. Sarah, a soft-spoken woman in her early 30s, worked as a teacher at a nearby school. She came into the cafe every morning for a coffee before heading to work. Her warm smile and kind eyes made her stand out, and Michael couldn't help but notice her. She was different from the women he had known before. She wasn't interested in his wealth or his status. She was simply kind, genuine, and sincere. In Sarah, Michael saw something he hadn't realized he was searching for all along. She didn't need him to be a millionaire. She didn't need anything from him except his company. Michael realized that he had been living a lie, pretending to be someone he wasn't, and he now longed to connect with her, to be someone she could trust. But first, he had to decide if he was ready to reveal his true self. Was Sarah someone who could accept him for who he really was, or would she reject him as everyone else had once he showed her the man behind the facade? As Michael pondered these questions, he understood that the unfamiliar situation he had thrown himself into was beginning to change him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was no longer just about pretending to be someone else. It was about discovering who he really was beneath the layers of wealth and status. And in that discovery, he was beginning to find the answers to the questions that had haunted him for years. In the weeks following his transformation, Michael found himself adapting to a life that was a far cry from the one he had known. At first, it felt like an experiment, something he was doing in an attempt to escape the trappings of wealth and superficiality. But as days turned into weeks, he realized that the change was deeper than he had expected. This new life was not just about working in a cafe and wearing simple clothes. It was about recalibrating his entire identity, learning how to interact with the world in a way he never had before. One of the most challenging aspects of this shift was the way people treated him now. In his old life, people often looked at him with a mixture of respect and awe, their conversations laced with compliments about his success and the lifestyle he led. His wealth had granted him access to a world of privilege, where doors were always open and people were eager to be in his orbit. But now, as Jake, no one knew or cared about his past. He was just another employee at the local cafe, working behind the counter with everyone else. It wasn't that people were unkind. They weren't, but the interactions were stripped of the flattery and politeness that he had become accustomed to. Here, Michael was just another person trying to make a living, and that stung more than he had anticipated. The first few days were especially hard. Michael would arrive at the cafe early in the morning, feeling out of place as he watched Frank, the owner, bustle around the kitchen, preparing for the morning rush. The cafe was always busy, with regulars coming in for their daily coffee or pastry, and Michael had to quickly learn how to keep up with the pace. He fumbled through the process of making drinks, burning the milk or misplacing orders, while the customers, who were mostly kind but unremarkable, watched him silently. It was a humbling experience. Michael had never been the one to make mistakes. He had always been the one with all the answers, the one who was expected to lead, but now he was an amateur in a world where people didn't expect perfection. But as time wore on, Michael began to find his rhythm. He was learning not just the mechanics of his job, but also the art of conversation. He noticed how people who came into the cafe each day would exchange pleasantries with the staff, chatting about their lives and sharing little anecdotes. The customers weren't talking about billion-dollar business deals or jet-setting to exotic destinations. Instead, they discussed their families, their struggles, and their dreams. It was something that Michael had been missing all along, the sense of connection. It wasn't about impressing anyone or showcasing how much money you made. It was about being genuine, being human. And this was something he had almost forgotten in the world he had left behind. Despite the warmth he felt from these connections, there were still moments of struggle. Michael often found himself longing for the comfort of his old life, the familiarity of high-end restaurants, private events, and power lunches. The contrast was stark. While working at the cafe, he had to work tirelessly, constantly on his feet, serving customers and cleaning up after the rush. There were no servants at his beck and call, no luxurious meals waiting for him at the end of a long day. After a full shift, Michael would return to his small apartment, which, though comfortable, felt far from the luxury of his penthouse. He didn't have the sprawling view of the city's skyline anymore, nor the marble countertops or the plush furniture that had once surrounded him. His apartment was small, humble, and functional, a stark reminder that he had chosen this life. On one particularly difficult evening, after a long shift of difficult customers and a series of mishaps with the espresso machine, Michael sat on his small couch, exhausted. He ran his hands through his hair and stared at the bare walls. There were no accolades, no signs of achievement hanging on the walls, no trophies or pictures of glamorous events. It was just him. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a strange sense of isolation. Even though he had built meaningful relationships with some of the regulars at the cafe, there were still moments when he missed the lifestyle he had once lived. But it was during these moments of doubt that Michael began to understand something fundamental about himself. He had been running from vulnerability for most of his life. His wealth had provided a shield, a way to protect himself from the discomfort of real human connections. If people saw him as a man of great wealth and status, they wouldn't have to see the complexities and flaws that lay beneath the surface. It was much easier to hide behind expensive suits and corporate dinners than it was to truly be seen for who he was. But now, working at the cafe, Michael had no choice but to confront this vulnerability head-on. The people around him didn't know him as the millionaire who could buy their loyalty. They saw him as Jake, the barista who made their coffee and learned their names. He had to let go of the armor that had protected him for so long. It was here, in these moments of struggle, that Michael began to make the most significant progress. Slowly, he started to embrace the challenges of his new life. Every mistake, every awkward conversation, every moment of self-doubt became an opportunity for growth. He learned how to navigate the awkwardness of his new life, how to laugh off his mistakes and move forward with humility. He no longer had the power to control every situation, but this lack of control brought him something he had never experienced before: freedom. For the first time in his life, he could be vulnerable without the fear of judgment. No one cared about his bank account or his career. What mattered now was how he treated others and how he allowed himself to be treated in return. One of the biggest revelations came when Michael began to build a deeper connection with Sarah, a regular customer at the cafe. At first, he admired her from afar. She was a teacher, and there was something undeniably warm and genuine about her. Sarah's presence made Michael feel at ease in a way he hadn't felt in years. She didn't look at him with awe or curiosity. She simply treated him as a person. They began talking more often, sharing stories about their lives. Michael found himself drawn to her compassion and strength, qualities he had always admired but never fully understood until now. She didn't need him to be anything other than himself, something Michael hadn't realized he had been craving. But even as their friendship deepened, Michael struggled with the fear that his past might catch up with him. Sarah was different from the women he had known in his former life. She wasn't interested in his wealth, and she didn't try to impress him with her own accomplishments. She was simple, humble, and honest. But as he spent more time with her, Michael began to realize that he hadn't fully let go of his past. He still found himself hiding little parts of who he was, afraid that the truth about his wealth would change the way she saw him. Despite all the progress he had made in adapting to his new life, he couldn't shake the feeling that his wealth was something that would always stand between them. As the weeks passed, Michael continued to adapt to the rhythm of cafe life, learning more about the people he interacted with and becoming more comfortable with his new identity. He began to embrace the simplicity of his life, finding joy in the small moments that came with connecting with others in an authentic way. He found contentment in knowing that his worth was no longer tied to the size of his bank account, but to the relationships he built and the person he was becoming. Yet, despite the progress, the internal struggle remained. Would Sarah still accept him when she found out who he really was? Would his past be too much for her to accept? Michael was learning that adaptation wasn't just about adjusting to a new job or lifestyle. It was about confronting his own insecurities and embracing vulnerability. He wasn't just changing his surroundings, he was changing from the inside out. And while this transformation was challenging, it was also the most rewarding thing he had ever done. The struggle to find true connection, to be seen and loved for who he was pushing him toward a deeper understanding of himself. And for the first time in his life, he was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was worthy of that connection. Michael had spent months transforming himself, both externally and internally. His goal was simple but profound: to find someone who loved him for who he truly was, not for the wealth and power that he had so often relied upon. He had adopted a new identity, left behind the trappings of his former life, and immersed himself in the world of ordinary people. Through his work at the cafe, his interactions with regular customers, and his growing connection with Sarah, he felt he was inching closer to his dream. But as he began to experience what he had hoped for, a deep, meaningful connection, he realized that achieving it was not as satisfying as he had imagined. Sarah had become the focal point of Michael's new life. Their friendship, which had started slowly, began to bloom into something more. She was warm, compassionate, and grounded, qualities that Michael had always admired but never fully understood until now. It was as though, in her presence, he could finally breathe. For the first time in years, he wasn't being judged by his success or his appearance. He was simply Jake, the barista who made great coffee and had an infectious laugh. With Sarah, he felt seen, truly seen, not as a wealthy man, but as a person with feelings, dreams, and insecurities. They spent countless hours together, both at the cafe and outside of it. They shared meals at local restaurants, went on long walks through the park, and had conversations that lasted long into the night. Michael found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He told Sarah about his childhood, the loneliness he had felt growing up in a world of privilege, and the weight of always having to prove himself. She listened intently, offering her thoughts and comforting words, never judging him. Sarah's authenticity was a balm to his soul, and Michael felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Here, in this small, intimate world, he had finally found the emotional connection he had been longing for. As the weeks passed, Michael began to believe that he had found what he had always wanted, a love that was not based on his wealth, but on his character. He had created this life for himself, a life where the superficial trappings of wealth no longer mattered, and where his relationship with Sarah was built on honesty and mutual respect. It felt like a victory, a validation of everything he had worked for. His life was no longer just about money and success. It was about love, simplicity, and being understood. Michael could finally breathe a sigh of relief, believing that he had reached the pinnacle of happiness. But as often happens in stories of self-discovery, what Michael thought he had wanted wasn't truly what he needed. And the moment of triumph that he had experienced would soon prove to be a false victory. For in the midst of this newfound love and sense of belonging, a critical part of Michael's life was still missing: his truth. The very thing that had driven him to adopt this new identity, the fear of being judged for his wealth, was about to confront him head-on, in a way he hadn't anticipated. The tipping point came one evening when Michael and Sarah were sitting at their favorite bench in the park, watching the sun set. Sarah, as she often did, turned to him with a smile, her eyes filled with warmth. "Jake, I'm really glad we met," she said softly, her voice carrying a sincerity that made Michael's heart swell. "I feel like I can talk to you about anything, and you really listen. You've become such a special person in my life." Michael felt his chest tighten with emotion. This was the moment he had dreamed of. This was what he had been searching for all along. But as he looked into Sarah's eyes, he felt the old fear creeping in. He had never told her the truth about who he was. She knew him as Jake, the regular guy working at the cafe, but she had no idea that the man sitting in front of her was actually Michael Anderson, a multimillionaire who could change her life with the stroke of a pen. His pulse quickened as the words danced on the tip of his tongue. He wanted to tell her. He had been living in fear of this moment, but now it seemed inevitable. Could he keep living this lie?
Cowl.
Did he continue to allow Sarah to love a version of him that wasn't entirely real? Was she falling in love with him, or with the persona he had created? With a deep breath, Michael began to speak. Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. His voice trembled slightly, betraying the anxiety he felt. Sarah looked at him, her expression soft, yet curious. I'm not really who you think I am, he continued, the words feeling foreign on his lips. I've been lying to you, and I've been lying to myself, too. My name is Michael, not Jake. I'm not just a guy who works at the cafe, I'm a millionaire. I've built a successful business, and I've spent most of my life living in luxury. Sarah blinked, taken aback by the revelation. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to a quiet, almost painful realization. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath as Michael watched Sarah's face for any sign of reaction. He had expected shock, maybe anger, but what he didn't expect was the silence that hung between them like a thick fog. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice quiet and measured. Why didn't you tell me this before? She asked, her eyes searching his face for some hint of the man she thought she knew. Why did you pretend to be someone else? Michael felt a pang of guilt in his chest, and his throat tightened. He had spent so much time convincing himself that he was doing the right thing by hiding his wealth, but now, faced with the consequences, he realized how deeply wrong it had been. I thought if you knew the truth, you wouldn't want to be with me. I thought that you'd see me as just another rich guy, and I didn't want that. I wanted you to love me for who I am, not for what I have. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the ground. Michael could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been so sure that this was the right choice, but now he wasn't so sure anymore. The very thing he had wanted, a relationship built on truth and sincerity, now seemed to be slipping away. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah finally looked up at him, her eyes soft but filled with a mix of sadness and frustration. You're right, she said, her voice steady. I would have loved you for who you are, Michael. But you didn't trust me enough to give me that chance. Instead, you built this false version of yourself, and now I'm left wondering who I've been falling in love with all this time. The words stung more than Michael had anticipated. He had thought that by hiding his wealth, he was protecting their relationship, but instead, he had created a barrier that was now separating them. The truth, which he had hoped would bring them closer, had only driven a wedge between them. It was then that Michael realized the painful truth. The life he had been living, the one he thought would bring him happiness, was nothing more than a mask. In his attempt to find love without the complications of his wealth, he had lost sight of the most important thing, the need for trust, honesty, and vulnerability. By pretending to be someone he wasn't, he had sabotaged his own happiness. In that moment, Michael understood that what he had wanted, the love and connection, was not enough without the foundation of truth. He had sought a life of simplicity, but in doing so, he had abandoned the very thing that had the potential to make everything worthwhile, honesty. And now, as Sarah stood up and walked away, Michael felt the sting of his own decisions. The victory he had sought, the false sense of triumph in being loved for who he was without the wealth, was in reality an illusion. It had cost him more than he had imagined, and it left him with the overwhelming realization that the love he had found was built on a foundation of deceit. As Sarah walked away, Michael sat there alone, the weight of his mistakes settling in. He had gotten what he thought he wanted, but it wasn't the truth he needed. And in that false victory, he had lost the very thing he was trying to protect. The days that followed Michael's confession were some of the most difficult of his life. The weight of his actions hung over him like a storm cloud, and the guilt of his deception gnawed at him relentlessly. He had sought love, authenticity, and simplicity, but now, in the wake of his revelation to Sarah, It felt as though he had lost everything he had worked so hard to build. Sarah had walked away, her trust shattered, and Michael was left to confront the stark reality that the life he had created for himself, one that he thought would bring him happiness, had crumbled around him. The café, once a place of warmth and comfort, now felt cold and empty. The familiar faces of the customers who had once greeted him with smiles now seemed distant and unfamiliar. His world had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated, and he was left grappling with the consequences of his choices. Each morning, he walked into the café with a sense of dread, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. The laughter that had once filled the space now felt like an echo of something he could never reclaim. Michael couldn't escape the overwhelming sense of loss. He had spent so long pretending to be someone else, someone he thought would be loved, that he hadn't realized how much he had sacrificed in the process. The truth, when it finally came out, had shattered not only Sarah's perception of him, but also his own. The image of himself he had so carefully crafted had crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. He had wanted to prove that he was worth loving without his wealth, but in doing so, he had failed to show the most important thing, his true self. His mind wandered back to the moments he had shared with Sarah. The late-night conversations, the shared laughter, the quiet moments when it felt as though the world had faded away and all that mattered was the connection between them. But now, those memories were tainted. They felt like a lie, like something he had fabricated in his own mind to justify the persona he had created. His heart ached as he thought of the way Sarah had looked at him when he told her the truth. The disappointment in her eyes had cut deeper than anything he had ever felt before. It wasn't the fact that he had hidden his wealth. It was the fact that he had hidden himself. Michael realized now that what he had truly wanted wasn't just love. It wasn't simply to be seen as a man of integrity, without the influence of wealth. What he had wanted, deep down, was to feel understood, to feel that he was more than just his riches, more than just his success. He had wanted to be seen for who he was, stripped of the layers of affluence and expectation that had always defined him. But in his effort to create a simpler, more relatable version of himself, he had overlooked the one thing that mattered the most: honesty. The pain of losing Sarah was compounded by the gnawing realization that he had never given her a fair chance to love him for who he truly was. He had assumed, based on his past experiences, that she would only see him as another rich man, someone who could provide her with wealth and material comfort, but not with emotional connection. In his attempt to protect her from that image, he had denied her the chance to know the real Michael, someone who, despite his wealth, craved genuine companionship and emotional intimacy. He thought about all the times Sarah had shared her own vulnerabilities with him, the struggles she had faced as a teacher, the challenges of living paycheck to paycheck, and the dreams she had for a better future. She had trusted him with her truth, and he had betrayed that trust by keeping his own hidden. Michael understood now that real love, true love, wasn't just about finding someone who accepted you for who you pretended to be. It was about being honest, vulnerable, and open. Without that, there could be no real connection. The weeks following Sarah's departure were filled with moments of deep introspection. Michael spent long hours walking the streets of the city, lost in thought, trying to piece together the remnants of his broken heart. The world around him seemed unchanged, but he had been irrevocably altered. The café, the one place he had once found solace, now felt suffocating. He began to question everything: his decision to leave his wealth behind, his decision to live a life of simplicity, and his assumption that love could be found by hiding who he was. But perhaps the hardest question of all was whether he could ever be truly happy again after everything he had lost. Despite the darkness that clouded his thoughts, Michael knew he couldn't keep running from his own mistakes. He had to face the consequences of his actions head-on. But how could he do that? How could he repair the damage he had caused, not only to Sarah but to himself? He had been so focused on proving that he could live a simpler life, that he had neglected the one thing that had always been at the core of his true self, his desire for authenticity. And now, that authenticity was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at the café, Michael found himself sitting alone in his apartment, staring out the window at the city skyline. The lights twinkled in the distance, but they no longer seemed as bright as they once had. His thoughts drifted back to Sarah once again. He remembered the first time they met, the way her smile had lit up the room, the way she had made him feel like he mattered, not because of what he had, but because of who he was. He had thought he was living the life he wanted, but now he understood that what he had truly wanted was to be loved for himself. And in that quest, he had lost sight of what was most important. It was then that Michael realized the painful truth. He had been living in fear. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, and fear of being seen as nothing more than a wealthy man with nothing else to offer. But in his attempt to protect himself, he had closed himself off to the very thing he had been seeking all along: authentic love. The lesson he had learned, though hard and costly, was clear. He had to be honest not just with others, but with himself. As the days passed, Michael made the difficult decision to try to repair the damage he had caused. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, and he understood that Sarah might never forgive him. But he couldn't allow the mistakes of his past to define his future. He had to take responsibility for his actions, no matter how painful that might be. He began by writing a letter to Sarah, pouring his heart out and expressing the truth of his feelings. He apologized for the deception, acknowledging the hurt and betrayal she must have felt. He told her that he had never meant to hurt her and that he now understood the value of honesty and vulnerability. He hoped that, in time, she could see that he was truly sorry and that he had learned from his mistakes. But Michael also knew that there was no guarantee that Sarah would ever read the letter, let alone forgive him. He had paid a heavy price for his actions, and he was unsure of what the future would hold. All he could do was wait and hope that someday Sarah would understand the depth of his regret and the sincerity of his love. As the days turned into weeks, Michael began to rebuild his life, one small step at a time. He continued to work at the cafe, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know if he would ever be able to regain Sarah's trust, but he was determined to be a better person, not just for her, but for himself. And in that journey of self-discovery, he found a glimmer of hope, a hope that, perhaps, one day he would find a love that was built on truth, trust, and authenticity. But for now, he would have to accept the price he had paid and learn to move forward with the lessons he had learned the hard way. After everything that had transpired, Michael knew that life would never be the same again. He had been through the crucible of deception, loss, and profound personal growth, and though the future was uncertain, he now carried a new sense of clarity about what truly mattered. As time passed, he found himself slowly returning to his old life. The cafe, the routines, the faces of regular customers who had never known the full story of his transformation. But this time it was different. The man who walked through the cafe doors was no longer the same man who had entered months ago, cloaked in secrets and a false identity. Now, he was armed with a new truth, one that was painful but necessary to his journey. Michael had spent long months reflecting on his choices and the lessons he had learned, but he was also mindful that the journey was far from over. In many ways, the real test was yet to come. Though he had gained a new understanding of himself, the world around him hadn't changed. People still carried the same expectations, the same assumptions, and he was now faced with the challenge of maintaining his authenticity in the face of those pressures. How could he remain true to who he had become when everything around him seemed designed to pull him back into his old ways? The first time Michael stepped into the cafe after his period of self-reflection, it felt strange. The smells, the sounds, the bustle of the place, it was all familiar, yet foreign. He had once seen the cafe as just a job, a place to hide from the world, but now it was different. The cafe was no longer a mask, a way to conceal his wealth, his true self. It was a place where he could confront who he was, where he could face his past without the burden of pretending. But as he stood behind the counter, taking orders and serving coffee, he realized just how much his past actions still lingered in his mind. The sting of Sarah's departure was still raw, and the guilt of his deception hadn't completely faded. Yet, for the first time, Michael could see beyond his mistakes and look at the future with cautious optimism. His work at the cafe had changed as well. Before, he had done it out of necessity, but now there was a purpose behind it. Michael had come to understand that, despite his wealth, the simple act of serving others brought him a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't known before. It wasn't the grand gestures of success that made him feel alive. It was the small, everyday moments, the smiles from customers, the conversations with regulars, and the sense of belonging that had always eluded him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't defined by the size of his bank account or the people he associated with. He was simply Michael, a man who wanted to contribute to the world in a meaningful way, regardless of how much money he had. But the real challenge came when Michael realized that while he had made strides in understanding himself, he had yet to repair the damage he had caused to his relationship with Sarah. The letter he had written to her months ago had gone unanswered, and with each passing day, he wondered if she would ever return to him. It was painful to accept, but Michael knew that he couldn't rush the healing process. He couldn't force Sarah to forgive him, no matter how badly he wanted it. All he could do was prove, through his actions, that he had learned the lessons that came with his mistakes, that he had changed for the better. For the first time, Michael started to embrace his wealth, but not as a symbol of superiority or success. He had come to see his financial resources as a tool, something that could be used to help others, to make a difference in the world, rather than something that could separate him from those around him. He began quietly using his wealth to support causes he cared about, anonymously funding scholarships for underprivileged students, donating to local charities, and providing financial support to small businesses in need. It wasn't about showing off his wealth. It was about creating a legacy of kindness and compassion, something that would reflect the true man he had become. Yet, despite all of his progress, Michael knew that he couldn't hide from his past forever. He had to face the people he had deceived, and he had to do it with humility. The cafe, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place where he could confront those who had known him only as a man of mystery, as someone who had worn a mask. The customers who had been regulars during his time at the cafe before his revelation still came in every day, oblivious to the changes that had taken place within him. They greeted him with the same smiles, the same pleasantries, and though they had no idea what had happened behind the scenes, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for their unwavering support. But there was still an ache inside him, a desire to make amends for the past, to show that he had truly changed. One afternoon, as Michael was preparing a cappuccino for a customer, he noticed a familiar face entering the cafe. It was Sarah. She had walked in as if nothing had changed, as though the world hadn't shifted beneath their feet. For a moment, Michael froze, unsure of how to approach her. His heart raced, and his mind scrambled for the right words. He had thought that he would have a moment of clarity when the time came to face Sarah again, but nothing had prepared him for this. She was standing there, looking just as beautiful as he remembered, but there was a sadness in her eyes, a distance that made his heart ache. Sarah noticed him too, and for a moment, the two of them just stood there, exchanging glances. There was no animosity, no anger in her eyes, just an underlying sense of hurt, of something unresolved between them. Michael walked over to her, trying to steady his breath, unsure of what to say. "Hi, Sarah," he said, his voice shaky. "I didn't expect to see you here." Sarah smiled faintly, but there was something guarded about her expression. "I didn't expect to come back, either," she replied, her voice soft. They stood there for a moment, an uncomfortable silence hanging between them. Finally, Michael spoke again. "I know I've hurt you," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And I can't undo what I did. But I want you to know that I've changed. I've learned so much from everything that happened, and I'm sorry for the way I treated you, for the way I lied." Sarah looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to apologize," she said quietly. I didn't know who you really were, and I'm still trying to figure out how to feel about all of this. About you." Michael nodded, understanding her hesitation. "I get it," he said, "but I'm not asking for anything from you. I just wanted to be honest with you, and I wanted to let you know that I've changed. I've learned that love isn't about who I pretend to be. It's about being real, being true to yourself, and giving without expecting anything in return. I know I didn't do that before. Sarah sighed, her eyes softening. I know, she said. And I believe you. I do. But it's going to take time. I can't just forget everything, Michael. I need to see that this isn't just a phase for you, that you've really changed. Michael felt a flicker of hope in his chest. I'll prove it, he said, his voice firm. One day at a time. And with that, Sarah smiled, a tentative but genuine smile, the first real smile he had seen from her in months. For the first time, Michael felt a sense of peace, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy and that healing would take time, but for the first time, he was no longer afraid of the future. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that love, in its truest form, is built on honesty, vulnerability, and the willingness to face your mista. And as he watched Sarah walk out of the cafe that day, he knew that whatever happened next, he was ready to face it, with her or without her, because he had finally learned how to be true to himself.